lesson today is called Brittle Clay. It's a reference to Daniel 2 and the statue that the king saw, and Daniel helped him interpret the prophecy in that. But we're not really entirely starting a new lesson. This is continuing on from the things that we learned last week, and we'll see how that fits in right away here. So if you remember from the king's dream, there was the head of gold, and there was the silver and arms and chest, and the bronze midriff area, and the iron legs. I'm hearing somebody in the background there. Um, and um, and so the legs were iron, and then they become, at the bottom here, they become what is called brittle clay, a mixture of brittle clay and iron. And that's going to be our focus, is that brittle clay and what is the meaning behind that brittle clay. And what we're going to pull forward from the last lesson is, if you remember, we looked at the idea that God saw that there were 4 empires in the past that he considered to be world empires. They commanded the world at their time. And those are going to be what we're going to see in this statue here. We're told outright that the Babylonian kingdom is the head of gold. And then we know what came after that. We know that the Medo-Persians came after that, and that was the chest of silver. And the Greeks came after that, and they were the bronze, and then the Romans were the iron legs. And so the only question we really have left is, what is that brittle clay? We don't know what that is exactly, and we're going to look at what the Bible says and try to understand that better from that. So that's what we're going to do. So this dream that the king had, he was determined to understand what this was. And this was a dream that God had given him, but he hadn't given him an understanding of what the dream meant. So the king had been lying in his bed wondering what the future was going to be, what his future was going to be, and what was going to happen in the world after that. And so the dream that God gave him was an answer to that, but he didn't give, God didn't give the king the answer. Instead, he decided that Daniel would be the one who would give him the answer. So God showed that same dream to Daniel and gave him the explanation of it. And Daniel was the one who was going to give the explanation to the king. And so this dream is the answer to the king's question of what's going to happen in the future. And so it goes through these 4 empires that we saw in the statue, and then it ends with 1/5 one that we'll see that describes the second coming, and that's the one where Jesus becomes the empire, the ruler of the world. And so we're going to look through that dream and understand that dream, but our focus is going to be mostly on the end and that brittle clay and what the brittle clay is. And that will help us to understand if we're in that time of the very feet, and we'll see that the toes are factored into that too. So, but we have another thing, and I always put too many things into these lessons, but here I am again. So we're going to also take a look at the idea of reading the Bible carefully, because the Bible very often says things in subtle ways that you have to be watching for or you'll miss them. And one of my favorite comes from Jesus speaking. And what's happened here, this is from Matthew 22, 31 to 32. And what we see there is the Sadducees had come to Jesus with some questions, and they were trying to trick him into thinking like them. But what happened is that Jesus responds to them and corrects them. And one of the things that he says there is, but concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God, who said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is the God, not of the dead, but of the living. Okay, so the Sadducees believed that man didn't have a spirit, and so when a man died, there was nothing left of him. And they also didn't believe that there was a resurrection day. And someday maybe we'll look at why the Sadducees believed these things, and that would be a good study. But right now, today, we're not going to do that. But the point is that Jesus sets them straight here by using a verb tense difference. So he says, I am. If you look at the scriptures, he says, if you look at God says, I am the God of them, not I was the God of them, you can tell that they're still alive. And that's a point that is made with nothing more than a difference in verb tense. So we see that there, Jesus is using that and saying that if you look closely at the scriptures and see the verb tense, you can understand it more deeply. And so those very small things in the Bible can be very important. And we're going to see a couple of those here. But overall, this prophecy in the statue is pretty easy to understand, but there's still some subtleties that you can pick out of it by looking very carefully at it. So outline here of what we're going to be covering. Daniel's prophecies, as I've said many times before, tend to be sweeps through time, and this one is very characteristic of that. He'll start at one place in time and then hop to another in the future, and then one that's even further in the future, and then another one that's even further in the future from that. And each government in this case is going to be described on this statue. And so the Babylonians are going to be told it is going to be the start of that, as I mentioned before, and it's going to end up with the millennial kingdom ruled by Jesus. And the statue's head through its toes are all of these kingdoms, and there's one more that's not part of the statue, but we hear about later on. So all of these metals that we see in the statue are going to be describing different kingdoms that are to come after the Babylonian kingdom, and it includes the Babylonian kingdom. So each one of those is described using a material of some sort. Mostly they're metal, gold, silver, bronze, steel, or iron, and but not all of them, and we'll see that, and that's going to be an important thing to understand too. So 5 governments are going to be described over time, and one of them changes over time, and we'll see that change, and that's an important thing. So here's the dream. This is Daniel describing the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar had this dream and he was very concerned to understand it correctly. He knew it was a message in it and he wanted to know that message, and it bothered him very much, and he wanted to make sure that people weren't going to be giving him some false interpretation of him, so he wouldn't tell anybody what the dream was. He wanted all of his wise men, the people who were the smartest in the kingdom, to be able to tell him the dream, and then that would convince him that their interpretation of the dream would be good and valid. But of course, none of them was able to do that, and only Daniel was able to do that, and because God had showed him what the meaning of the dream was. So beginning here, yeah, it's one of those days. So beginning here, the dream, as described by Daniel, is this. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the earth. Okay, so that's Daniel describing the dream that the king had had. And now he's going to go and break that down and explain all of those elements of that and what they mean. So he begins to explain that dream, starting with the golden head. And that is, as we know, the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. So he says, Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. So he explains the head of gold that way. Now notice one thing he says here is King of Kings, and we brought that up last week too. This was the idea of a conquering kingdom, a kingdom that sets out to conquer the whole world or everything that they can conquer. We know the Babylonians didn't conquer very much, but they conquered everything that mattered to God. And we talked about what matters to God there. And so he says, wherever they live in that kingdom, of course, it doesn't mean people in India or China. It means everything in their kingdom. He has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. So we know right away that the head represents the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. That one's pretty easy. So the next verse, and it's a very short verse, says, After you, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. Now, this word inferior is one of those words that you need to notice in there because there's meaning in that. The meaning is, in what way is this inferior? It doesn't actually say, but we can see that this is silver and the other one was gold. So we see that something is inferior. It isn't clear what exactly is being measured here, and we're going to talk about that later on. But he says this kingdom is inferior in the same way that silver is inferior to gold. And that sets up the whole pattern here. This isn't just about randomly chosen metals. There is a sequence here of things getting worse in all of these. Each one of these is going to be inferior to the next one. Now, that's not going to be said with every one, but that's what we're supposed to understand from the word inferior here, is that these metals, in the same way that their value is inferior, silver is worth less than gold, bronze less than silver. Um, these are all going to be inferior in sequence as they come. And we'll talk about that more, as I said. Okay, so the Babylonian Empire um, is a strange choice here. But what Daniel has just talked about with the Babylonian Empire is that they were a terrible place. And so why would you think that the Medo-Persian Empire was going to be any better than them? The Bible has many references to Babylon being a place of great sin and evil. And so it's kind of strange for him to have been calling the Babylonian kingdom and Nebuchadnezzar a wonderful leader of everything, and the gold head of the statue, the best of the best. And so how does that make any sense here? So some of those references in the Bible to Babylon being an evil place, I've listed here. First one comes from 1 Peter 5:13, and he says he's writing from the chosen church which is in Babylon, and they invoke your peace. And so what he's actually talking about there, he's in Jerusalem at that time, writing from Jerusalem, and he refers to Jerusalem as being Babylon because it's evil. So he's using Babylon as a reference for evil, and that's strange to see God in the previous reference to gold talking about Babylon being gold, being the greatest, being the best. And that depends on different things, and one of the things here that God is measuring is what we're going to talk about. So another verse, actually, there's a bunch of them from Revelation that refer to that. And this is one that says, and another, the second one, followed him and said, Fallen, fallen, Babylon the Great, who gave all nations to drink of the passion of her fornication. So this is a reference actually to the Roman Catholic Church and its daughter churches as being evil. And again, that name Babylon is being used to describe something evil. So it seems very strange to us that they would be considered the best part of the statue, the gold part of the statue, and other kingdoms would be successively worse than that. Nonetheless, what God is measuring here is important, and we'll see that. So everyone agrees that this silver empire, the silver on that statue, represents the Medo-Persian Empire. And the book of Daniel actually describes that change there when the Medes and the Persians conquered the Babylonians. If you remember the handwriting on the wall, the finger on the wall, all of that describes that period of time when that change happened. The Babylonian Empire, as we talked about last week, came up very quickly, but was incompetently managed and became weak because of it. And the Medes and Persians stormed in and took it over during the time of Daniel. So the next one on the statue is the belly and the thighs, which are made of bronze. And there's still a very short verse on this one. And it says, next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the earth. And all of the people who study this prophecy have a pretty good agreement that this is talking about the kingdom of the Greeks, kingdom of Greece. And Daniel actually was aware of the Greeks. That we don't see much mention of them in the Bible, but there is a little bit of a mention to them. And there's an angel in one of the books of Daniel that talks to Daniel about this. And he says, I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. So I am leaving, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. So the angel right there is telling him the Medo-Persians' time is about to come to an end. The angel has to go and return to that fight to put an end to the prince of Persia, and after that, the prince of Greece is about to come. So we see in the Old Testament of the Bible that there was some understanding that Greece was becoming an empire and becoming a power, or would become a power. And notice that it says this third kingdom will rule over the whole earth. Now we know from our study yesterday, or last week, I should say, that ruling over the earth doesn't mean the whole surface of the earth. It means that part of the earth that is important to God. And the Greek Empire, yes, it was a big-sized empire, not as big as the Roman became, but it still ruled over everything that matters to God. And that's kind of this part of this definition of what is an empire as God sees empires. So the last stage on the statue is altogether the legs, the feet, and the toes, and they're all treated as one empire, an empire that goes through changes. And so this empire starts out as iron, pure iron in the legs, and then it becomes clay mixed into the iron in the feet, and then in the toes it becomes toes that are a mixture of both of those, but those 10 toes have some important meaning to them as well. So the verse from Daniel says, Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. So this kingdom is going to come and sweep in and crush and break all the other empires that existed before that. And we know this is going to be the Roman Empire, and that was really classically them, as they stomped everything, traveled all over a big part of the Mediterranean world, and ruled over all of that with an iron rod, you could say. And so it hints here at the idea when it says what other kingdoms, and it's referring to the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Greek, and the kingdoms that they conquered. So the Romans conquered all of the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, and the Greeks had conquered all of those little kingdoms that they had conquered, as well as the whole Greek Empire. So, and there's good agreement that this iron is Roman. Not absolutely everybody agrees to that, but most people say, yeah, it only makes sense that this is the Roman Empire that's being talked about here. And as we discussed yesterday, those were the four that were empires, as God called them empires. So we talked about the legs and then the feet and then the toes. And so now we'll talk a little bit about the feet and the toes. And this is where the clay starts to get mixed in. And Daniel talks about that. He says, just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, okay? A kingdom that isn't really working together. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. So what's happened here is the Iron Kingdom has continued on for a length of time and is now changing. And this clay, this baked clay that we're going to be focusing on a little bit more in the later on, begins to be mixed into it. And so it began as legs and becomes feet, and then it's going to finish as toes, but it's all the same empire. And it begins as iron, becomes mixed with clay, and ends as 10 kingdoms that are made of iron and clay, is the verses that we're going to be looking at here. So keep that in mind, that it's all one kingdom, but it goes through changes near the end. So this is Daniel 2:42 through 43 now. As the toes, I was talking about just the toes here, were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And this is the brittle clay that is the title for this message, and we will see more about that and try to understand what is meant by brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. So he's saying there that not only is the kingdom broken into these divisions of clay and iron, the people themselves are going to be broken into those same mixtures. And that keyword brittle we're going to look at more later. And so the 10 toes we see from other prophecies in Daniel are describing 10 kingdoms. And I've talked about that many times in the past. And how the Antichrist comes up in them and conquers 3 of those kingdoms. And Revelation also talks about this, but these verses don't talk about that. It just mentions these 10 toes. But the 10 toes do represent 10 kingdoms that come in the end time. And so lots of verses, Daniel, if you want to look them up, you can reference that, and Revelation reference that idea of these 10 kingdoms. And Daniel here is representing them as a mixture of iron and clay. But in Daniel, in other places in Daniel and in Revelation as well, they are described as beasts with heads. And we won't go into that this week. So the interpretation of the prophecy continues on now to talk about the rock that destroyed all of this. In the time of those kings, the 10 kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all of those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will in itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. So what that's saying in short is, while these 10 kings are ruling, their kingdoms are going to be brought to an end, and something is going to crush them, which means they're going to be humbled by force. And they are going to be forced to accept that there is another king who is over them. So, but what we need to understand here is that the rock doesn't come in the sequence of the things in the statue. And the message from that is that it doesn't come from mankind. Those kingdoms of mankind, from the head on down to the toes, were the kingdoms that we know from the world here. But this kingdom that's going to come, this rock that's going to destroy all of this, doesn't come from humans. It comes from elsewhere. And we know what it says here. It says the rock is cut out of a mountain. And we'll look at that some more as we get into the depths of this. So it's not from the lineage of man. It's not created by human hands. It's an eternal kingdom, he says. It's not going to be destroyed, and it's not going to be vacated or left to somebody else. And he's talking about the millennial kingdom here. So when we see that, we understand that this statue has covered all of history in jumps from Nebuchadnezzar's time in the Babylonian Empire down through to the millennial kingdom. So more about the rock. And this is actually going to jump back a little bit. When Daniel was first explaining it, he said some things there that he didn't say when he repeated his description. And I wanted to look through that because some of that is interesting. He says, while you were watching, a rock was cut out. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces, and the wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. So it says the rock strikes the statue specifically on the feet. It doesn't say on the toes, and that's kind of interesting there. I'm not entirely sure why it says it that way. You would think that it would say it would strike the statue on the toes, but it doesn't say it that way. So that's kind of an open question. But it does say, no trace of the kingdoms of men is left. And this is going to be an interesting thing. At this time, we're in a Roman kingdom, it's saying, and we have no Babylonian kingdom around. We have no kingdom of Greece. We have no Medo-Persian kingdom. None of those kingdoms are around anymore. But it says these are still existing, and this rock is going to destroy all of that. And that's going to make some sense here in just a minute when we start to look at how God looks at these things. But he does say the rock was cut out of a mountain, and we understand the mountain to be God and the rock that was cut out to be the Son of God. That makes complete sense. And then it says this rock grows into a mountain, and that is obviously talking about Jesus spreading his influence across the earth, because it goes on to say he filled the whole earth. But it also may be kind of a hidden reference to the mountain of God, which is in Jerusalem, which is kind of the center point of God's focus and his attention. So this description steps a little bit out of the metaphor when it says fills the whole earth, because it hasn't been mentioning the earth before in this way, but it kind of changes its viewpoint suddenly at the end. Okay, so now we're going to look at these materials that all these kingdoms are described as, because there's a message in there. I mentioned earlier that inferior is in there, and we'll see what else is said. Now, not all of those metals are given a characteristic, but some of them are. It doesn't say anything about the characteristic of gold. I guess you're just supposed to understand what gold is. But it does say silver is inferior, and I mentioned that sets up the understanding that all of these in sequence is going to be inferior to the previous one, each one getting worse. So it doesn't say anything about what bronze is. It doesn't characterize that kingdom that way. But for iron, it does. It says iron is hard or strong. It uses the word both. And then it says that clay is brittle. And so we understand kind of the Roman Empire being a hard empire, and clay being brittle is not so clear, and we're going to look at that more. But you can see two sequences that are in these materials. One is the value. You can see that gold, which is still our monetary standard, here we are 2,600 years later, and silver is still second to gold in monetary value. And so we can see that inferiority of silver to gold still exists in our time. And the same thing with clay. If we have something made of clay, pottery, or whatever, if it breaks, we usually throw it out because it really isn't repairable. We now have some super glues and stuff like that can hold it together, but you can still see the crack where it was. You can never get those things to go back exactly the way they were. And so usually when something of clay or pottery breaks, we just throw it out because it can't be fixed. And that's important to understand here, is that the clay is so brittle and irreparable that it is of no value to God. So it starts out with gold being of high value and the clay being of almost no value. And so that also, okay, we understand the value aspect of this is that gold and silver are valuable. Clay is brittle and not valuable. When it breaks, it's useless. So there's that value aspect, but there's also another thing that is hardness. The hardness of these materials is in sequence as well. And gold is the softest. I think we know that. Gold, you can if you're strong enough, you can often bend gold yourself with the pliers or something like that. So gold is fairly soft. Silver is harder. Bronze is harder still. Iron is harder again. And clay is hard, but it shatters. And so when you put enough pressure on clay, it doesn't just bend, it shatters into pieces. And if you've ever dropped a plate on the floor and it shatters into a whole pile of pieces, you know what I'm talking about. So that's another aspect that's true of the sequence of metals, is that the metals can be reformed and reshaped, and clay cannot. Clay just breaks and is brittle and isn't good for anything once it's broken. And if you haven't caught it already, I want you to see that there's a spiritual meaning in this sequence. There's more to it than just metals and the sequence of empires. It's talking about something spiritual about these. And the meaning really is that and this might surprise you, but the reason that the Babylonian Empire is gold is because they were a people who were malleable. They could be bent, they could be reshaped spiritually. And that actually did happen to Nebuchadnezzar, if you remember that story about him being reshaped. And so these were people who had a spiritual sense of some sort, but they didn't know the right God, of course. But they still had a spirituality to them. And so what's being measured, one of those things from God's perspective, is a declining sense of the spiritual. And so it's not just measuring the value of these empires, just measuring their spiritual value, what that means to God, their ability to be reshaped into people that God wants them to be. And so um, this isn't really about um, physical existence and things like that. It's God is looking at their spiritual value to Him, and that should make sense to us. And so what we see here in these harder and harder materials is a declining ability to be reshaped into what God wants. And so that's kind of a statement about those empires is progressively they become worse and worse at being reshaped until you get to the point where you're talking about clay, which can't be reshaped at all. If you try to reshape clay, it just shatters and it's broken and useless. Um, so there is that definite meaning in there. But along with that, I think there's even more that goes with that. And there's also an increasingly rigid justice without or with a declining mercy. So increasing justice and declining mercy over time. And you can kind of see that in some historical things that were going on at that time. If you remember, the Babylonian Empire had a guy called Hammurabi, and Hammurabi developed one of the legal codes, the first really written legal code. And so we see the codification of law happening in the Babylonian Empire. The Medes and the Persians, if you remember from part of Daniel, they had a very rigid law. It was even something that stopped the king from acting. So if the king made a law, he couldn't break his own law. And that became a problem in the story of Esther, if you remember how that worked. So the Medo-Persians had taken the idea of a rigid law that applied to everybody. And the Romans, again, they developed published laws and a legal system based on representing agents, adversarial agents representing your case, how the justice system worked. And so there seemed to be a succession of changes in the legal systems of these that resulted in, I think, rigid justice and declining mercy in those. And so we went from a period of judges, if you remember with the Hebrews, where the judges were just men that had been appointed to interpret the law, to judges now who are in a system and controlled by that system, and they don't have the freedom to show mercy all the time or to really do justice all the time. And so because I can see that there, it seems like there might be another aspect of this that is related to that spiritual aspect, which is as the declining spiritual happens through these sequences of empires, we also see increasingly rigid justice with a declining mercy shown to people. So that seems to be in the background as well. So question two. Now these questions are questions that some of them I referred to in there, but some of them you should have been asking yourself. carefully reading that thing and saying, why are these things this way? And why are these words being used? And this is another one. And we dealt with this one last week, really, is why only these four kingdoms? Why aren't there other kingdoms? At that time, there were Chinese, a large number of Chinese, Egyptians, Indians. There were lots of other peoples around. There are people in North America that are never mentioned. Um, British, American empires came later on. All of those things. Why are none of those other kingdoms represented in this statue? Why is it only these particular four? And we talked about that because God has this definition for an empire. And the definition has two parts to it. One is that these were kings of kings, meaning that they were conquerors who intended to conquer the entire world. That was their goal. And these four had that as part of their character. And the other aspect of it is that they ruled over Jerusalem and Jews when they conquered. And so those two things make up God's definition of who is a world empire. And that's why they're the only four that show up in here, why all those others, and some of them that were contemporaneous with the times of those statues, we don't see them mentioned. It's only these four that ever get mentioned. Okay, so question number 3 is also an interesting question. By definition, then, we are living in a Roman world. And how can that be? That doesn't seem to make any sense. The Roman Empire died out around 500 AD, which is 1500 years ago. They were long gone after that. So how can it be that God still considers this to be a Roman world? And when you look around and really look at things, you'll see an awful lot of Rome still here. And one of those things is our government and legal systems. As I said, Rome was the first place to really put together a legal system like that, where you had representatives that acted on your behalf in the legal system. And a lot of words to do with government and legal systems come to us from that. And one of those is Senate. Senate is a Roman word. That's where it came from, is Latin. And Senate in Latin actually means old guys. So these were supposed to be the old guys that had the wisdom, was a part of their function in the system of the political system of that time, was that they were supposed to be the wise ones. And that's supposed to be true of our Senate as well, too. And the word Congress also comes from the Latin word. And in Latin, it means walking together. And so the idea is that these were people who were supposed to walk and talk together and discuss and settle things and make decisions about how the government should run things. So a lot of words in government and legal systems come from Latin. Another thing that is an interesting characteristic that carries on down to us is that Rome prided itself on its technology. Now, its technology wasn't like ours, but they did things like aqueducts, which were very novel for that time. They piped water all over the place to make sure that they had water where they needed it. And they were very proud of that. And that was part of the reason that they had trouble with the Jews rejecting them, is that they saw the Jews as rejecting all this wonderful technology and wisdom that they had, and they saw the Jews as being stupid for doing that. And we also have that in other names too. Some of our month names come from Latin. September, which is the Latin word for 7. October, which is based on the number 8. And November for 9. December for 10. And these are based on Latin names, Latin numbers. And so our months still retain some of that. And if you notice that December, which is the last month on the calendar, our calendar anyway, is kind of strangely numbered 10 because there are 12 months and not 10 months. And that's because the old Roman calendar had 10 months and they had kind of a gap between their months. And um, and so 10 is what they use, but later on they added 2 months to fill in that gap. And when they did that, they named the 7th and the 8th months after 2 of their Caesars, Julius and Augustus, and that's July and August. So as we can see, our month names are strongly derived from Latin names for things. And there's lots of other things like that, names that are in different places. And our weeks of the day have that same thing attached to them. Sunday comes from Roman times as the day that was set for the worship of the invincible sun. Sol Invictus, they called it. They had another day that they called Saturn Day, which you would recognize as Saturday. So a lot of these Latin influences are still existing in our culture. If you look at this page, all of the characters on this page come from the Roman alphabet. It's not Hebrew, it's not Greek, it's Roman, and that Roman alphabet traveled with the Roman soldiers, and now almost all of Western Europe is based on that. A lot of Eastern Europe is based on that. Certainly the Americas are based on that. And so that Roman alphabet is spread all over the world. And we don't use it so much now. When I was a young kid, we actually had to learn Roman numerals and how to do math in Roman numerals. I don't think kids probably still learn that anymore. But we still use Roman numerals on clocks and on Super Bowl games, for one. Those are always numbered in Roman numerals. So we see that Latin number system being used. Latin names are also used in medicine and science quite a bit. I won't give you any examples there. So plainly, you can see that much of Rome is still hanging around here. It's still infected and influencing us. And there's still some Greek hanging around too. There are lots of Greek words that we use and we don't even realize they come from Greek roots. And there's still Babylonian things hanging around too. The name of Easter is actually coming from the name Ishtar, which is a Babylonian goddess. So we have influences from Roman, some from Greek, and some even from Babylonian times that are still hanging around in our culture. And that's an important thing to understand here in this next question. And so that question talks about the rock destroying everything, and it specifies each one individually. It isn't just destroying the 10 toes or the feet, it's destroying everything. And so the actual verse says, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. So all the way up the statue, it says it broke all of that stuff. And those empires are all gone. But what we're talking about is the influence of those empires that has continued on down to ours. So what that rock does is it destroys all of these bad influences that have come from all of these empires over time. So um, it's destroying the beliefs that came down from those, and I mentioned that with the goddess Easter coming from Babylonian. A lot of their ideas about how to live your life and ideas like that, a lot of their values and practices and things like that have come down to us. And we may not realize a lot of these things that we do and say and the words we use are coming from these previous conquering kingdoms, but nonetheless they are. Um, I talked about Easter, but Halloween and Christmas also have roots that go way back. And Pastor's sermon last week was all about Halloween and its roots that go all the way back to Babylonian times. So all of these bad things have come down to us from those kingdoms. And so this destruction is not just destroying empires, it's more about destroying the influences that they spread around with those empires. So, uh, and that's true of the rock also. It becomes a mountain that fills the earth and therefore replaces all of these things with God's kingdom instead. And so it's going to be a big change for us when that happens. It's going to be a monumental change in how we look at the world, the values that we have, a lot of things like that when the second coming happens are going to make a big shift. And I've talked about that in the past lessons. So question 5 here, where in the legs are we? We're really getting to the point of these toes. It talked about the legs and the feet and the toes as being 3 stages in the Iron Kingdom. And so we wonder now, are we into the toes yet? Or are we just in the feet, or are we still in the legs? And so no one would claim that we're currently in a 10-toed world where there are 10 ruling kingdoms. You look around and you just can't see 10 ruling kingdoms. So we ask, are we in the feet then? We're certainly not in the toes. Are we in the feet? And the feet talk about the kingdom and the people are a mixture of iron and clay. That comes from Daniel 2:42-43. And so it says both the kingdoms and the people are a mix of iron and clay. The iron and the clay do not mix, which means they don't work together well. They don't even associate with each other, you might say it that way. The verses also talk about the clay being brittle, and clay is brittle. We talked about that, but it also becomes weaker with age and more brittle. So a lot of old things tend to break more easily as they get older. And also the idea we've seen here is that the clay has no value or little value. It's as common as clay as an expression that some people have used. And it also, once it's shaped and hardened, it can't be reshaped. It's brittle and has no value once it's been broken. If you try to reshape it, it just breaks and then it has no value. Um, so these four items that I've listed here are what the Bible says about the clay. And so these are the things that we're going to look at to see if we can identify who this clay. It's not a kingdom. These are these clay people, I guess is how you would describe it, as people who are brittle and have these other aspects to them. And so any candidate that you have in interpreting this prophecy has to fit these four things that the Bible says about the clay. And we're going to try and do that next. So to me, you can take this or leave it as you want, clay it seems to be a good description, a good fit for socialism and Marxism, whatever you want to call it. It goes under a whole bunch of different names. But and I'll explain how I see that, and that'll maybe help you how to understand prophecy and interpret it yourself if you don't agree. But I think there are good reasons to believe that that's the situation here. So it's called brittle. Is socialism brittle? Would be our question to ask. Brittle means something that's hard but liable to break or shatter easily. Okay, so is socialism hard? Yeah, it can be. When socialism is in it, has a totalitarian control, which is what socialism always wants, but doesn't always achieve. It is hard. It is unforgiving. It is merciless. It is cruel, and you can easily see how it would be talked about as being hard. But it's also brittle, and we've seen that in the past. If you're old enough, you remember these things. If not, then maybe you've read about them. But the communist government, many of the communist governments over the world, we thought that they would never end. It seemed like they were invincible. But then all of a sudden they crashed and shattered. The USSR, if you're old enough to remember that, which used to be Russia and a bunch of places that have been conquered by Russia, was a company, a country, I guess, that looked like it was invincible. And it looked like it was a world power and a threat to all good people. And all of a sudden it collapsed in on itself and it doesn't exist anymore. And the same thing at the same time with East Germany. They looked like it looked like Germany would never be reunified. There would never be a time when they would be able to take down the wall that separated West and East Germany. But East Germany collapsed at the same time and became nothing. And now there is just one Germany. They've reunited again. And so that's that shattering you see aspect of being very hard, but suddenly shattering and unexpectedly shattering like that. So without totalitarianism, though, if they don't get to being a totalitarian government where they can control everybody, it soon shatters for other reasons. It just never is able to form a government. And you can see that in a lot of things about the attitude of those socialist, Marxist, ultra liberals, whatever you want to call them, is that one thing that they want to do is they want to create laws for other people, but they want to do whatever they want themselves. And that creates a person or a groups of people that shatter easily because each person in the group thinks that he's right and shouldn't have to follow anybody else's laws, but he thinks that he should be able to set the laws for other people. And so that obviously can't work well together. And so that results in people who fight against each other because they can't agree on anything, but each person thinks that their rules should apply to the other person. And we see these ideas and we express these ideas as elitism, where they think that the law shouldn't apply to them, but they should be able to make laws for other people. And there's a hypocrisy that's built into that, and there's injustice that's built into all of that. So this idea that, yes,
Can I offer something also?
sure,
Uh, this reminds me of the fact that they're actually, really pushing this green energy, and they want us all to ride the bus or a bicycle to work or whatever. But they're flying around in airplanes and they're using these big heavy cars. They
yeah.
want you to disarm yourself, but they're surrounded with a bunch of people with guns and so forth and so on. So we're seeing a lot of that even in America today.
Yeah, yeah, we certainly are. There are lots of examples of that where, and with the COVID, we've seen that too. Them making laws about having to wear masks in social situations, but they don't do it themselves. And so that elitism, that idea that even the rules that I make for others shouldn't apply to me, is really a core thing to the leftist idea. And I talked about that when I talked about liberals in the church and that idea that they hate laws being applied to them, but they love to apply laws to other people. And so what this results in within people like that who haven't got a totalitarian government is something that we describe as the left eats its own. And what happens is they fight among themselves and destroy each other. Um, One person isn't following the rules properly, and another person rats on him, and they do that sort of thing all the time. And they tend to factionalize, break into groups, and that's why there are so many different names for this. It's not just socialism; it's Marxism, Leninism, Trotskyism, and a whole bunch of other names like that, because each one was a little different, had different ideas on different things, and they couldn't work with the others. And so this is the shattering that you see, and the shattering comes from that fact that they don't like laws being applied to them, but they like to apply laws to others, and that really makes them weak that way. And other authors have noticed this. It was a few months ago now that I saw two different articles come out in the same week, I think it was, where two different authors said, you know, you could think of the political far left as being brittle because of the way they act and the things that result from what they do. And when I saw that, I said, "Ooh, boy, that's talking about Daniel's statue." And these guys aren't even Christians; they don't even know that. So um, other people have identified socialism, Marxism, the leftist ideas as being brittle in that sense. So I think that that's a good match there. The other three values we'll talk about here, they do not mix, and that's obvious to us. Socialism does not mix with capitalism. It just they don't like us, don't care for us, and it doesn't work. And so you can't work together that way. And so socialism can't mix because it can't be stable without totalitarianism. It breaks down as it shatters, and so whenever they try to do something, they fall apart, and they're also intolerant of others' ideas because of all of this. And so because of that, they just don't mix well with others. They don't play well with others. So I think that that's a good match too. Of little value, as common as clay, cannot be reshaped as God sees it. Is that also true of socialism? And I think it is. Atheism is the foundation of that. So that's not a good thing as God sees it. Government is God for them. They see the government as being the power that should be in charge of everything in your whole life and tell you what to do. And that is a role that God has reserved for himself. And of course, those people are naturally spiritually dead. They aren't people who are interested in God in any way, shape, or form. They have their own God, which is their government or themselves sometimes. And so they really don't have any spiritual value to God. And it's not easy for him to ever reshape those kind of people. And part of that is, and you can see that when you think of the things that you may have heard said by people of the far left, and what do they all really come down to? If you boil it right down to the very bare bones, what is the founding thought between the way they view the world? And it is that we are gods who are smart enough to create our own universe. And so they think that it's completely natural that they should be able to redefine men and women in some other way, or redefine races being different and some being better than others. To them, that makes sense because they think that they are gods. They have that authority. There is no authority greater than them. And so they see no problem with changing things that have been things that we've held on to for a long time, since biblical times. And so this idea goes all the way back to Eve, and it's a rejection of God saying, I'm going to be God instead, and I won't accept the idea that there's another God. So I think that that one's also a good match. And the feet being made of both clay mixed in with iron, and we do see that in the world at both levels. We see that in governments. There are, like China is plainly a socialist communist government, and other countries that are not that kind of a government. But we also see it in the peoples. Some of the people in our own country obviously have those socialist ideas to them, and there are other people who don't have those ideas to them, and they don't work together. So I think on all four of those points that the Bible lists, socialism is a good match for what is described there. Now, that's my own interpretation. So I'll summarize this and then we'll be done. Um, One point I wanted to make was the importance of reading the Bible carefully, and we saw that in here. Some of the words and you need to be watching for, because the words are telling you things that are important, even though there might just be a single word. And that's true of reading the Bible, and of course it's especially true of reading prophecy. God hides things in prophecies. This one about the statue is a pretty easy one. There are a lot more things that are very hard to understand. So how do we approach the Bible and prophecy, especially when we're reading it? And these things are things that I've mentioned before, but I'll say them again. You need to be prayerful and humble. that's always your attitude, or should always be your attitude towards God and His Word. And so whenever you go to read the Bible, you need to have that attitude, and it should be your attitude throughout your life, really. And read carefully. That's part of what I've been pointing out here is these words have meanings. They have um, subtle meanings to them sometimes hidden meanings. But you can get more by reading carefully what the words say and understanding them. And that goes back to what Jesus was saying. If you look at the verb tense, then you can see that people are alive after death. They aren't vanished. So, and read everything you can find about a topic. If you're trying to find information on a particular topic, read all of the different places in the Bible that deal with that, and put all that information together, assemble those pieces together, and make sense of them that way. Too often I see people who just read a few verses and try to interpret them without any context to them. So apply context always. And look for God's perspective when you're looking at things. And this isn't just prophecy, this is reading the Bible. What is God's interest here? And God's interest is spiritual. He's not so interested in the physical, He's interested in the spiritual person, what's inside of you. And sometimes a thing you can do to help you understand these words is to actually look them up in the original language. And that's something you can do without knowing the original language, because there are sources that will help you do that. And the reason you might want to do that is translators sometimes make mistakes. They choose a word that makes sense to them. But if you understand it better, you realize that that isn't fitting very well. And you can find out that other translators may have translated it differently, and have a look at those. And sometimes translators actually do evil things. They intentionally twist verses to mean what they didn't mean. And there are lots of examples of that as well. So that's reading the Bible and prophecy especially. Those are things that you can do that will help you to understand. And summarizing this whole prophecy about Nebuchadnezzar, this dream was given to Nebuchadnezzar somewhere between 600 BC and 562 BC. So that's about 2,600 years ago. Um, and we can see how the gold and the silver and the bronze empires came and went. That's documented throughout history what they were. The gold was the Babylonian. We saw that said explicitly, and we can follow that through to the others, and we can see that those came and they went, and those empires are gone now. But we see that the Iron Empire came, but it never left. What happened there is kind of interesting. And I mentioned this last week, is that the Jews were driven out under the Roman Empire, and they were no longer in their homeland. And so that was the last empire that could ever have conquered Jews in Jerusalem. And there hasn't been one since that would fit that description. So the Roman Empire, we saw it come, and we see even today its influence has grown over most of the earth as it spread through Europe and now into North and South America, all over a big chunk of the world. The Roman Empire is still here and still influencing people in our time. And we also saw that socialism and Marxism seems to be a good fit for clay. It meets those 4 biblical requirements that we saw from the scripture. And so now maybe what people often do, and I hope I haven't done it here, is they will try to fit things into their own time and say, what in my time would fit this? And I think that I haven't done that, but it's a trap to get into, always to watch for. But what we've seen throughout history is there weren't socialist kind of governments until relatively recently, and so that fits with the feet starting to become clay, and then the toes becoming clay and iron. And so it's something that has come in recently. It didn't exist before, and that seems to be true here as well. So I don't think I've just taken something from my time and said, here, this fits. I think I've actually looked at it in a historical context that matches up with what the statue was describing. So if I'm right about that, we are in the time of the feet of the statue. But we're not into the toes yet. We're waiting for a change to those 10 toes, that 10 governments that rule all of the world that matters is what we're looking for. And we just don't see that yet. And so we know that there's going to be at some point a big change, and this will happen. So I think this is hopefully the last slide here. So we live in the time of iron and clay. And so this is applying it to ourselves a little bit now. We saw that God sees iron as having a low value. It's difficult to reshape, but it can be reshaped. And we saw that clay had even less value. It's impossible to reshape. You can't do anything to bend clay or do anything like that to make it back into a better form or even return it to a previous form. And so clay has almost no value to God. And of course, we're talking about spiritual things here. And so to us, there's another message in here that we shouldn't be hard as iron ourselves, nor brittle as clay. That shouldn't be what we are. We shouldn't be people who are difficult for God to reshape and to use for his purposes. We should be the gold of the statue. We should be the people who are much more easily reshaped. And even more easily than that, we should desire to be reshaped by God. We should be soft and smushy and easy to reshape into whatever God wants us to be. And so um, we should also have a spiritual mind that desires God, and that's part of that. Once you have that spiritual mind, that spiritual outlook, and you have that desire to be what God wants you to be, then you will be the kind of person that God can reshape into what he wants you to be. And so having that spiritual mind is a key aspect to that.